Welcome to the House of Hypertrophy. Are your exercises enough to optimize growth across regions of a muscle? Can a muscle even grow unevenly across its regions? Many say it can't, but it can. Multiple scientific studies demonstrate muscles do not always grow evenly across its regions, and there are potentially two key takeaways. Many are probably unaware of this fascinating data. Today, we'll dissect this to understand what this may and may not mean for developing an overall aesthetic physique. We'll also mention some interesting new research on the biceps later on. Let's dive in. What comes to your mind when I say regional muscle hypertrophy? Classically, people think about the shape of a muscle, such as how some people have biceps with a high peak and others with longer biceps. If you have one or the other, could you train to change this? Unfortunately, no compelling evidence suggests this precisely is possible. However, it does appear that the proximal, middle, and distal regions of a muscle do not always grow uniformly. For those unaware, proximal refers to the region of a muscle closer to its origin, while the distal is the part further away from the origin. The middle region is of course in between. Now, unequal growth across these regions does technically cause a change in the shape of the muscle, but we'll address later if this is enough to be visually meaningful. Let's start with the intriguing range of motion literature. There are generally three range of motions. A full range of motion moves the joints in the exercise to the fullest potential, such as fully extending and bending the elbow during a curl. A partial at short length partially moves through the range where the muscle is at a shorter length, such as the top part of a curl. A partial at long length partially moves through the part where the muscle is at a longer length, such as the bottom part of a curl. We have a couple of studies comparing growth across the regions of a muscle between different range of motions, and there seems to be a consistent pattern. This paper compared full range of motion to partial at short lengths on the leg extension. Growth of the vastus lateralis at the proximal portion leaned towards the full range of motion. Growth at the middle region was fairly similar, and growth at the distal region was considerably better with the full range of motion. This idea that full range of motion may be considerably better for the distal regions was also found with a squat in this paper. One group squatted to 120 degrees of knee flexion, while a second squatted to 60 degrees. The partial at short length only grew the proximal regions of the thigh and actually lost size at the distal regions. The 120 degree squats grew all regions fairly similarly, and so the biggest difference between the two was again at the distal regions. You may be questioning how it's possible for the partial to slightly lose some size. I'll likely expand on this in a future video, but there's evidence that certain muscle parts can decrease in size even when training. Anyhow, what about partials at long lengths? This study compared partials at long to short lengths on the leg extension. Growth across all three regions of the vastus lateralis favored the long length partials, but it was only statistically significant and considerably different at the distal region. So similar to a full range of motion, partials at long lengths also seem to produce considerably better distal region growth when compared to partials at short lengths. We've seen this with the biceps too. This study compared partials at long to short lengths on the preacher curl. Growth at the middle region of the biceps was actually similar between both, while growth at the distal region was better with the partials at long lengths. Are there any differences between a partial at long length and full range of motion? We've mentioned previously at the House of Hypertrophy that 3 studies have compared them, and all of them fascinatingly find overall more hypertrophy with partials at long lengths, but only one examined growth across different muscle regions. This paper involved training the leg extension with either a full range of motion, partial at long length, and partial at short length. And growth was measured across 4 regions of the vastus lateralis and rectus femoris. With the vastus lateralis, consistent with the research we've seen, the partial at short lengths produced notably lower growth at the 60 and 70% regions, but were fairly decent at growing the 40 and 50% regions. When focusing on the comparison between the partial at long length to full range of motion, the biggest difference was the partial at long length tended to produce better growth at the 60 and especially 70% regions. With the rectus femoris, again consistent with the research we've seen, the partials at short lengths produce notably lower growth at the 60 and 70% regions, but were fairly decent at growing the 40 and 50% regions. When focusing on the comparison between the partial at long length to full range motion, we can actually see that in all regions the growth favored the long length partials, with the biggest difference at the 50 and 70% regions. There's not strong enough evidence to say if partials at long lengths always beat out a full range of motion yet. All three studies have been done on previously untrained subjects, and there are many exercises that haven't been explored yet. But as this early evidence is promising, you could experiment with long length partials if you like. Anyhow, the main point is the range of motion research clearly shows muscles do not always grow evenly across their regions, and there's a pattern. Short length partials decently grow the proximal and middle regions of a muscle, and we've seen sometimes it produces similar growth of these regions to a full range of motion or partial at long length. However, partials at short lengths fail to optimize growth at the distal regions, and sometimes result in essentially no growth at these regions. Many might not have been expecting this, and may have been hoping for a precise method to optimize growth at each region. We are about to detail how different exercises impact growth across regions. But here's the practical takeaway for this section. If your goal is to maximally grow all regions, of course, a full range of motion or even partial at long length is recommended. But you could say that if, for whatever reason, you wanted to keep down growth at the distal part of a muscle, a partial at short length may do this successfully. Remember, this research was done on the quads or biceps, but my best guess is it probably applies to other muscles. For example, the pec's distal region is near the arm, while the proximal region is near the sternum and clavicle. Perhaps partials at short lengths do well at developing the proximal and middle regions, but are not as effective as a full range of motion or partial at long length for the distal regions. Likewise, the lat's distal region is near the arm, while the proximal region is closer to the spine. Perhaps partials at short lengths do well at developing the proximal and middle regions, but are not as effective as a full range of motion or partial at long length for the distal regions. This is speculation as there's no direct research on this yet. Hopefully this changes soon. Also, all of these studies lasted a few months, so it's difficult to say what happens after years. For example, if with a leg extension one person trained with short length partials and another with long length partials for years, my best guess is you may visually see the differences, with a partial at long length resulting in comparatively more pronounced development, especially at the distal regions. Yet, as there's no long-term studies, I would be lying if I said I was certain. Another area of the research showing muscles do not always grow equally across its regions is the exercise comparison literature. Much of this has been done on biarticular muscles, which are muscles that cross over two joints. These are the main biarticular muscles. For example, the biceps cross the shoulder and elbow joints. As alluded to in the introduction, there's actually some exciting new research on the biceps that I'll reveal in a second, but let's start with the quads. We recently covered this study comparing leaning back to normal leg extensions. All four quad heads cross the knee joint, but the rectus femoris is biarticular as it also crosses the hip joint. Leaning back places the rectus femoris specifically at a longer length, that is, it stretched more, and this resulted in more proximal and distal region hypertrophy compared to the normal leg extensions. But notice that the biggest difference between the two exercises was at the proximal region, further demonstrating how muscle growth can be unevenly distributed. Similar logic applies to the hamstrings. 3 of the 4 hamstring muscles are biarticular as they cross the knee and hip. They are at a longer length with seated leg curls compared to lying leg curls. The researchers only looked at proximal and distal region growth of 2 of the biarticular hamstring muscles. Both experienced better proximal and distal region hypertrophy with the seated leg curl. But again, the biggest difference between the two exercises tended to be at the proximal regions. As for the biceps data I hinted at, this abstract has been revealed. It's not published yet, but it compared incline curls to preacher curls. Incline curls placed the biceps at a starting longer length than preacher curls. The abstract tells us that overall biceps hypertrophy was greater with the incline curl, with the authors mentioning the biggest difference was at the proximal regions. Regular viewers who've seen our previous videos on the biceps may have a ton of questions, but once this study is officially published, I'll share all my thoughts. But for now, I do think incline curls are up there as one of the best biceps exercises. So in total, it seems that compared to training a biarticular muscle at a shorter length, training at a longer length builds more muscle with larger differences at the proximal regions. This could possibly apply to the triceps and gastrocnemius too, but it's not super clear based on the data we have. This requires a bit of explaining. So if you're interested, check out the pinned comment where I fully detail the research and my thoughts on regional hypertrophy with these muscles. Summoning the spirit of scientific accuracy. This idea of larger differences at the proximal region between training biarticular muscles at long versus short lengths is based on 3 studies. So I don't want to pretend this is an established fact yet. Perhaps there's other unknown details. For example, could some sort of threshold exist? For instance, leaning back leg extensions produced more overall growth than normal leg extensions, but lying down leg extensions lengthen the rectus femoris even more than leaning back. But does it produce more growth? It might not, as this study found although lying leg extension successfully resulted in more activation, especially at the proximal and middle regions compared to normal leg extensions, it wasn't any more effective than leaning back. If anything, its activation was actually slightly lower with lying down. We are working on guides to developing each muscle, with a few already published. These will flesh out more details about exercise recommendations, so feel free to check these out and stay tuned for more updated content. I'll also add that if you have any questions or confusions, I'll do my best to respond in the comments. Similar to the discussion on range of motion, these results might not have been what you wanted. Perhaps some of you want a certain exercise to grow one region, and another exercise to grow a different region, but this doesn't seem to be the case. Rather, the simple takeaway is ensuring you have exercises that train biarticular muscles at longer lengths is probably a solid idea. However, you could alternatively say, if, for whatever reason, the extra proximal region growth is not desired, training biarticular muscles at short lengths could be useful, though we've seen they are also sometimes less effective for distal region growth too. As some final words, if you're a regular viewer of the House of Hypertrophy, the information here may not have necessarily changed your training, but I nonetheless hope it helps understand your own training or just your general knowledge on muscle hypertrophy in some way. Plus, I still think this research is pretty underrated, as many still believe muscles grow evenly across all regions. It can be tricky and very challenging to construct your own muscle building program, but the Alpha Progression app, which is essentially your personal clever muscle building assistant in the palm of your hand, can easily help you. With hundreds of thousands of downloads, thousands of reviews speak to its unmatched quality. Other apps truly generate garbage programs, but this app intelligently gets you closer to your dream physique through generating an evidence-based program 100% customizable to your needs. Simply let it know all about you, your experience level, the equipment you have, how often and how long you can train for, and if you want to focus or neglect certain muscles. This can all take less than a minute, and you can still make further edits if you like. The app has extra impressive features. During workouts, the app's algorithm carefully suggests how you may progressive overload to help push you to the next level. Aesthetic graphs automatically display your long-term progress, and there is a huge exercise database of all the best muscle building exercises. Try out every single one of the premium features to your heart's desire during a free 2-week trial through the link in the comments and description. If you like it and choose to go beyond, the link cuts the price of a subscription by 20%. I truly believe the app is exceptional, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. Here's the key summary points. Feel free to check out the Alpha Progression app or another one of the videos at the House of Hypertrophy.